First of all, welcome everyone. Super excited to have everyone and have Peter joining our event today. I'm just going to quickly run through a couple housekeeping items, and then we'll jump right into it. So first, I wanted to thank our sponsors. Big shout out to Broadridge, Alliance Advisors, Revell, and also our in-kind sponsors of PR Newswire and Sandman Media. Please make sure to check out these great firms. Again, thank you for all the support in the chapter. Wouldn't be able to do it without our sponsors. Second, we're super excited to announce our next meeting, which will be a dinner with Matt Brush and Niels Holt with NIRI National. That's going to be held on Thursday, May 11th. We'll be getting an invite out for that shortly, so be on the lookout and save that date for us. And finally, a huge thank you to Rebecca for coordinating this event. Super excited about this one. We want to make this as interactive as possible, so please use the reactions tool down at the bottom of the Zoom and raise your hand, and Rebecca will be able to call on you and get you included in the conversation. So with that, I will turn it over to Rebecca. Thank you, and Peter. I'm going to go off camera for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. So I'm Rebecca Gardy. I'm the Chief Investor Relations Officer for Campbell Soup Company and a board member of NIRI Philadelphia. And it is my pleasure to host Peter McDermott from Korn Ferry. Peter is a senior client partner at Korn Ferry's New York office, working in the Corporate Affairs Center of Expertise. He specializes in executive search for corporate communications and investor relations professionals across industries. He's got extensive experience placing senior level talent across the US, Europe, and Asia. Prior to joining Korn Ferry, he worked at Taylor Bennett and at Sextant Search Partners. Peter's actively involved in professional organizations, including the Lagrant Foundation, Page Up, and the National Investor Relations Institute. He holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Richmond in Rhetoric and Communication Studies, American Studies, Ethics Studies, and History. Welcome, Peter. I know we've known each other for quite a while, and I know you have a presentation for us, so I'll just jump in with questions along the way. And as Alex said, I'm sure our audience will have some as well. So with that, Peter, take it away.
Thanks, Rebecca, and it's great to connect with everyone. I think I know everyone on this call, or 90% of everyone on this call fairly well. So, as we have a smaller group that's joined today, feel free to raise your hand, as Rebecca and Alex said, and or interrupt me with questions and ask away. We have our National Investor Relations Institute Korn Ferry survey on the investor relations function that we do every 2 years. And we want to center our conversation today around the results that we saw in last year's survey, which are very interesting results and kind of show data behind my own perspectives around the function. We're also going to cover off the market in general, what we're seeing in terms of IR hiring trends, career development, and all of that great stuff. Before we jump into that, for those of you who are not familiar with Korn Ferry, we have we're a publicly traded company ourselves. We're about a $2.6 billion market cap right now. When I started about 8 years ago, we were hovering around $1 billion, and our stock was at I think $18. It's now in the 50s or 60s. So, we've seen our own interesting equity story at Korn Ferry. I started off at Korn Ferry when we were defining our investor relations practice as part of corporate affairs. We had done a couple of investor relations searches over the years as part of our CFO practice, but our corporate affairs practice had just done the Alibaba search, which had made quite a splash. And we brought on board Jane Penner, who did the huge IPO with Alibaba, came on board from Google. And from that point forward, Korn Ferry started defining a pretty strong platform in terms of investor relations search under what I was leading here. And so, I bring that up because about 8 years ago is when I saw personally, coming back from London, the upswing of the seriousness of investor relations and the fact that, this is finally a role that had a seat at the table with every executive team out there, was always a direct report to the CFO, was starting to tack on other function responsibility and build out the career of the investor relations officer. So, we've seen a very interesting, evolution on the qualitative side through all of the searches that we've managed and through the business that we built at Korn Ferry, but we also have the quantitative side through all of the data with NIRI. Can you all see this okay? That's showing up on the screen share? Great. So when we started this survey, we had we had a number of questions that we asked. A lot of them focused around compensation. We're still able to ask compensation questions today, and we were able to last year for this. We're seeing pay equity laws getting in the way of our ability to ask certain compensation questions. But when we look back at the first survey in 1999, the average base salary of the head of investor relations was $98,000. When we started doing the survey in the mid 2010s, and we're coming out with the results, I think in 2016 or 2017, the base salary, the average base salary across the Fortune 500 was $251,000. We're now seeing the average base salary go up to the $276,000 to $350,000 range. So if you look at the median there, the median is starting to creep into the 300s, which is fantastic for the function overall because, again, this role is now caught up with the other peer functions that you see across the finance leadership team. In terms of the broadening of the function, we're also seeing the fact that this is no longer a bag carrier, meeting planner, PR person for the CFO. If you look at the IR function about 25, 30 years ago, this person was sitting in a seat where they were making the calls and doing some of the logistics behind analyst meetings and roadshows and conferences, but the CFO was the one that was talking on earnings calls and was the face of the organization to the street. We're now seeing that the investor relations officer, the head of investor relations, at every organization across the board is the one that's driving that narrative. And because of that, we need to have a left brain, right brain dynamic of knowing the messaging and the communication side, building that narrative, and also having the financial acumen and kind of that CFA IRC mindset of an analyst or an MBA that knows how to model and knows how to take that financial content and put it into that financial messaging for investor relations. And that's a very unique skill set to have, especially for the newer generation in IR. The legacy or current generation of IR leaders, we were all trained and educated throughout university in being strong writers and in knowing the math side of things. These days, universities are not necessarily pumping out strong writers anymore. University graduates are not writing paper after paper after paper. It's a little bit of a different educational perspective when you look at the new generation. So they're not necessarily being set up to be positioned for success in a role like IR. And we were talking before everyone dialed in about the number twos out there. That is one of the reasons why it's so tough to build a team in IR is because, again, it's such a unique set of skills that you need to be successful in this role. We brought up this statistic in our key findings because we found that it was interesting, knowing that a number of investor relations leaders are looking to move on to something bigger, broader, that they've got a CFO seat in their future. They could move on to a different company or get recruited away. 71% do not have a clear move for themselves next, and only 20% have a succession plan in place for themselves if they were to step away. That is a huge opportunity for us as an investor relations community. We've been talking about diversity for decades at NIRI, and the fact that we have great statistics around gender pay equity and gender diversity in IR, but we don't have great statistics around ethnic diversity and thinking about how we can build a succession plan, and build out a diverse succession plan could actually impact that in the future. And it's something that we bring up to clients when we talk about number two searches, because again, you're able to be a little bit more creative when looking at pools of candidates and analysts and agencies and kind of out of the box ideas rather than looking just at corporate IR leaders for those succession plans. Curious for the corporate leaders on the call, who even has a number two position or a number two resource, or if most of you are all, on an island or a sole contributor here where you lean on other resources or borrow other resources? Does anyone on the call have a number two or have a team?
I see lots of our board members on the call. So here we go from Tim Power. Thankfully, not a sole contributor. I've got a senior analyst on my team, and then an open kind of associate director role on my team. And then I have an admin that I share with my CFO.
This is Christiana from Five Below. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, so I am a sole IR contributor, and I oversee treasury as well, where I have an analyst and a senior analyst, but I do beg, borrow, and steal resources throughout the company as well as have outside consultants helping as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty typical model where you know, as you prove the value of investor relations and take on other functions, you're able to kind of show that symphony that comes together when you have all these different pieces that work together. And again, it's only over the past 8 to 10 years that we've even seen these number two roles approved and scoped out. So it's a good pattern we're seeing. I don't ever predict that we're going to have teams of 25 in investor relations unless a lot changes out there. But I'm optimistic that we are going to start to see a lot more number twos, and that we're going to see more chapters of NIRI Next Gen like we see in New York, and really, again, promote those deputy roles.
I've got a question for you, Peter. Because there's so many folks that are sole contributors, do you see a lot of rotational kind of flex positions where, during the quarter, someone will flex over from the FP&A team, for example?
We do, and we see a lot of entry into investor relations through that, where someone steps in the interim, falls in love with it, and says, "This is for me." More often than not, I've had a couple of people come to me lately and said, "I'm a director, a number two in my current IR function. The company's not promoting me because my boss isn't going anywhere. They're scoping out other roles outside of IR. I don't want to leave IR just to get a VP role, just to help my career, but I have hit a ceiling. What do I do here?" And that's where, again, they're in a tricky spot because there's not a lot for them to do to stay in IR. They're going to have to move out of the function, and they've really fallen in love with it. So.
Yeah, so career pathing, I think, is kind of a common theme in this conversation, right?
Yes.
For us and for, the folks under us.
And it's tough. I mean, I haven't met a single person who graduated college thinking I want to become a head of investor relations or I want to become an investor relations officer. Usually they're falling into it through the analyst route or through a communications or IR agency, or they take that interim step internally, and it just works out for them. I feel like it's tough to prescriptively plan your career and say, this is what I want to be and this is where I want to go, but you can start to raise your hand for certain things internally to make yourself an attractive candidate for whatever is next in IR. Because I don't think a lot of us know what the function is going to look like in 5 years. I know it's not going to look the same as it looks today, just like today it doesn't look like it looked 5 years ago. But the craziness in the market and the fact that we have so much up and down with ESG and pressure points from inflation to interest rates to whatever's happening in the political world, investor relations at the center of everything, and is going to need to start tacking on things to continue to adapt to whatever's next. So
Right.
Career planning to a point, but you can't be so targeted, or you're going to start to see yourself fall behind in terms of the modern function.
Yep.
We report some of these statistics in the broader NIRI report. I don't think any of this is very surprising. We've seen a huge range. some of the, bigger private equity platforms or some of the bigger organizations that we've worked with, they have base salaries that are climbing into the 400s or 500s. Those are that's the tip of the iceberg when you look at the curve here. The more than 30% is the range to kind of focus on aiming for, because that's a more viable range to get into. And if you're within a Fortune 100 and you've got a 3 in front of your base salary, the rest should be in bonus and equity, and that's where we see a huge difference in terms of the ranges. Some of the tech organizations that we work with give enormous amounts of equity. Other organizations are pretty standard about it and only give a couple $100,000 or a percentage of your base salary. We've also been measuring education credentials, and we have seen, an uptick in terms of CFAs, MBAs, and some kind of advanced degree that's going to help you position yourself as being, having that strong financial acumen to be successful in investor relations. The function, continues to shift. We're seeing that certain CEOs and CFOs and boards, with the activity in the media over the past couple of years, every brand is expected to have a point of view on some pretty issues-rich topics. That all is integrated with ESG strategies and making sure that you're aligned and sticking to your core data points that you're messaging to your analysts and to your IR stakeholders, and working with communications and your communications counterpart to make sure that whatever they're saying in the media or whatever your C-suite and board is saying in the media aligns with what you're telling to your investor stakeholders. So when we talk about the more complex operating environment and the fact that you need to be mindful of a proactive strategy to have an early warning system for risk and activism and digital media situations that spin out of control and might impact your equity story, working together and kind of thinking through that evolution, and the fact that investor relations, while it might be an island when it comes to resources, it just cannot be an island when it comes to that stakeholder map and thinking about building relationships across your peer team, and everybody that works on that executive team, from the general counsel all the way over to HR and everyone in between. We also, again, not to harp on reporting relationships, because some of our clients can't change this, and we understand that when we're retained for searches that we sometimes need to work with legacy reporting structures, but we really encourage that the investor relations function have a direct line into the CFO and have access to the CEO and to the board. That, is the best structure to think through here. Anything else should have a story behind it, and we always have, a bit of context. If we are working on an assignment, it could be that the VP of Investor Relations is so fantastic that they've been promoted to oversee Treasury and FP&A and, strategy and corporate development, and, they might be more of the deputy CFO. The CFO might be thinking about retirement in the next year. When we call you for a search, we'll tell you that story. If HR is calling you directly, or if a company is calling you directly, and there's something that you're thinking is a flag, like a reporting relationship, or that they might not sound like they understand investor relations, really try to get to the meat of that and then figure out why and what's going on. And I often tell people that, not to go around the back of HR too much, but it's often helpful to contact someone on the finance team if you have a connection and say, I see you made a move into Treasury from a different industry. I just, I'm interviewing for your IR role, and I'm thinking about an industry transition. I'd love to grab a cup of coffee and think about, how I could best prepare for this interview. If you have 5 minutes, would really appreciate that. They'll read between the lines and figure out, like, oh man, this person's floundering with HR here. Their resume looks great. I should probably show them to the CFO and make sure that we get this person involved in the interview process.
Peter, I recall when I first started in IR, there were a lot of my peers that were within the communications department. Are you seeing a lot less of that now?
We are seeing less communications moving into investor relations. Some communications professionals want to move into investor relations. The closest they get without the credentials is financial communications. So dealing with the financial media like the Wall Street Journal and New York Times and, working with you in messaging to the media. I don't see a clean shift from comms into IR anymore just because it has such a focus on that financial acumen. We rarely have a search come to us that says, we have such a bench strength in finance, we don't need that. We're really looking for the messaging expert. Otherwise, it would just shift to a communications role.
And then conversely, are you seeing a lot of buy side, sell side analysts moving into IR? And what do you think about that?
We are. It's a very, it's a shift we've seen over the past 5 or 6 years. When it works well, but when it doesn't work, it really explodes and it's complete, transplant rejection. And when we get the question from CFOs, hiring managers around analyst candidates, I typically let them know that, the analysts could be institutional investor ranked, they could be great, they could be, well rated, they could be this, they could be that, but it's all going to come down to the fit factor and what we were talking about before. This role is never going to have a lot of resources. A lot of times the senior analysts are used to delegating and are used to having a lot of junior folks working for them and a big desk to lean on. That's never going to happen in corporate investor relations. So we like to suss that out right away. Oftentimes I open an interview, and if I'm not able to ask a question in the first 20 minutes, I know already that person's not going to be an efficient communications, investor relations leader. And if they're not going to be able to be, take advantage of 5 minutes with the CEO. If they're in sales mode too much, that's another flag to us, because that again is not, the one-way street of messaging is not make for a successful investor relations platform. It's a two-way relationship. So if we can't get a question in and aren't able to push back, we also ask about motivations, and everyone on this call will laugh if you're in corporate IR. If someone answers with more, I've heard that investor relations has more work-life balance, higher compensation, it's easier. We've heard that answer. We always see that as a huge flag and just think like you're not getting into this for the right reasons. You've obviously talked to someone who does this on the side and takes on a client once in a while as a consultant and isn't really a full-time consultant or a full-time investor relations leader. So we do see it, and when it works, but it's the minority of the population that interviews that's actually successful in getting through to the offer.
And so as a candidate, how would you position yourself competitively when you know that the company may be looking at buy side or sell side analysts in particular, right? It seems like the management teams gravitate towards their research capabilities or their modeling skills. But to your point, there's so much more involved that has to do with their ability to influence, up and downstream within an organization.
Yes. And so if you're an IR candidate looking for a new role and you don't have analyst experience, and the CFO is looking for that, you need to consider how to prove your financial acumen and the fact that you're going to have immediate credibility on the street, just like an analyst and on the other side of the IR equation would have from their relationships and from what they've done throughout their career. So I talk to equity analysts, make sure you do your research, make sure you have a finger on the pulse, and weave that messaging into your interviews so that they have no question about your ability to plug into that role.
Yeah.
Conversely, if you're an equity analyst and you're interviewing against corporate IR folks, I do the exact same thing where you talk to your friends in corporate IR and really get to the heart of what the role is. Don't go off of your assumptions from your equity analyst career about what you think the other side is doing day to day, because you have no real idea of what day-to-day corporate IR looks like if you haven't done it before.
Yeah, I think Alex, you have a question.
Yeah, Peter, you mentioned switching back and forth between different industries. Are you seeing more or less of that now for IROs? Is it has COVID opened that up, or actually has it shut it down given the remote nature and being able to kind of be wherever you need to be from a company's perspective?
So we still see a huge amount of career diversity within investor relations, and I think that you can easily move within industries if you are, a smart investor relations professional. There are some outliers. Healthcare is always insular in terms of their hiring, and if you're in pharma, biotech, you're going to be in that world. And you're probably going to want to stay in that world because those are where your relationships are. If you break out of that world, it's tougher to break back in because you're going to be interviewing against other, healthcare professionals with that industry depth. Every other industry that we see out there, sometimes the client asks for it, but it's not necessary for success. General industrials, manufacturing, energy, utilities, metals and mining, transportation. We see a lot of movement in between all of those different sectors. If you're on the consultancy side looking to get into corporate IR, we see a lot of folks that have a peppering of generalist clients and then focus on technology or fintech or whatever it might be. So yes, we still see a lot of career diversity. I'd say healthcare is an outlier, and some of the other legacy industries, if you've stayed in that industry forever, like if you're an auto guy or an auto woman or an auto person, and you've stayed in that industry, you're probably going to stay in auto. But it's not as typical anymore.
Peter, if you do get that opportunity, right, where there was a management team that was open to looking at candidates outside that outside that industry, any suggestions from your standpoint on how to make yourself shine and really lean in hard to those IR attributes and be able to shine above those that have the experience within the industry?
So when you look at interview preparation for roles like this, again, back to like the question we get from analysts around like work-life balance, that kind of thing, a lot of times that's coupled with, I've applied to 150 roles and I haven't gotten a call back. And that's where we think like, what are you doing? You're throwing a bunch of wet noodles at the wall to see what sticks. You're obviously not doing your research into these opportunities if you're just applying on LinkedIn. So, getting back to the answer for your question, I would research the role, the company as much as you can, and be very selective about the opportunities that you're engaging in. Don't go out and say yes to everything that you're getting a call about. Really think through why that organization is interesting, why you're confident about the equity story moving forward. Depends, again, what the motivation for the IR hire might be. If it's an IPO, if it's a spin, think through before the interview how you would go about doing that build from scratch. If it's a transformation, think through examples from your career about how you brought an organization through a transformation in the past and how you've gone in measuring the success of that, and show that in terms of the data through your interviews with the stakeholders that you're talking to, because they're not going to be able to argue with the data there. So we have a lot of folks that just assume that they can go in with their resume thinking it'll speak for itself. That's never really the case, and you do need to research and come through with suggestions and a point of view, because that's what they're hiring you for. They're not looking for you to be a fly on the wall here.
Great advice. Thanks, Peter.
Again, feel free to ask questions as I move through the deck, because we're just going to go through some other general slides here. We're finding that, again, CFOs are focusing on certain attributes in investor relations. Some of these are things that you can't really measure in terms of technical skills, like having the ability to model, or CFA, or an MBA, or whatever it might be. It's more the fact that you're coming forward and never being the person that says that's not my position description. You're raising your hand for everything and anything. And again, it's because we see IR at the center of that wheel of everything that the company and the executive team touches. And so you're going to have a point of view on everything from the corporate strategy, performance, and you're able to come up with an action plan and show what the organization should do moving forward and what the future plan should be for the team. We've outlined what we advise clients to look for in best-in-class investor relations leaders. None of this will surprise anyone because, again, it's aligned with everything that I've been saying in terms of knowing how to work through every piece of the investor relations puzzle, from the financial literacy piece to communications and presentation skills. We've seen a lot of CFOs coming forward with commentary around, my IR leader is not proactive enough. I'm always the one asking for things. I'm always chasing things before earnings. Why isn't it ever ready for me? So again, when you think about what organizations look for, it's not always that technical attribute. Sometimes, again, it's the good relationships with the broader team, like communications, and being able to package together all of that information, manage up, and give it to the C-suite in an efficient manner. Excuse me. Market conditions have been interesting. When I started off in investor relations, so, backing up a bit, I told you all about my Korn Ferry story. I started off my career in executive search. I started off in a financial services focused firm. I was doing private equity, private capital, hedge fund, banking searches. It was a great introduction into executive search, but it was the early 2000s leading up to the big, financial crash and the Great Recession, and that firm fell apart. At that point, I got introduced to a communications firm, which led to my investor relations focus at their partner firm in London. When I was doing searches in London, this was about a decade ago, we were getting a new investor relations search every couple of weeks. When I started off at Korn Ferry, it was every couple of weeks, and then when we got busy in the mid 2010s, we were getting a search every week, every other week in investor relations. After COVID had happened and the talent wars started in 2020 and 2021, and we saw the huge SPAC IPO boom, we started getting calls multiple times a week. And there were multiple weeks where we get a call every day about a new investor relations role. This was largely in part to roles being created out of thin air because of SPAC IPOs and the fact that we saw such an IPO boom. There was a real shift in terms of candidates looking for roles versus open roles, the supply and demand. The investor relations roles that we were working on before 2020 were always pretty sparse, and we were, we never had trouble finding very, very attractive candidates with well-managed careers that were interested in those opportunities. During the 2020-2021 boom, the dynamics completely shifted, and all of a sudden we were calling folks at communications agencies that were looking to get into investor relations, and they were asking for ridiculous salaries. They did not move forward to interview, but we were seeing this kind of confidence from a younger or more kind of Gen Z talent base because of the marketplace activity. And again, for about a year there, the activity that we saw in terms of our investor relations practice at Korn Ferry put me at the center of our CFO practice because we were doing more IR searches than we were other financial leadership roles at Korn Ferry. So IR, and I'm sure you all saw this yourselves, you were getting calls left and right, we were getting calls left and right, and there was a complete uptick in terms of investor relations hiring and the ability to build out number twos, number threes, and team sizes. That's now, contracted a little bit, but we're still seeing a busyness and a churn because CFOs and executive teams are seeing the fact that investor relations is a role that they can't do without right now. They know that if something happens like, whatever it might be on the political side, on the healthcare side, and, global events, interest rates, that investor relations is at the center of everything and needs to be, needs to be at that top level, can't be down leveled again. So the boom that we saw is a good thing. I don't think it's going to happen again for a while, but it's kind of cemented the importance of your function in the executive team. Did you have a question, Rebecca?
No, I was going to ask, I'm still kind of thinking about the conversation we had a couple minutes ago about kind of the candidates. I was wondering, there was this flurry of activity. A lot of folks were getting into roles, as some of us more seasoned IROs kind of watched from the sidelines, knowing that it wasn't going to go well. How would you describe, when you've seen folks not do well, right? What were they missing, I guess? Like, how do you, for us some of us are hiring, what do you see not go well with candidates?
Sometimes when we see failed investor relations hires, it's because of the CFO and the executive team and the board misunderstanding the investor relations ability to move the ticker price, move the stock. When we walk into a meeting with a hiring manager or whoever's in charge of making the investor relations hire, and they say things like, we want this person to move the multiple, or we want this person to move the stock price, we have to really get to the heart of the matter that this person cannot do that. This person can shift the messaging and build relationships with analysts on the street to ensure that they better understand the transformation that the organization is going through, which will therefore hopefully impact the investor story, the investor narrative, and you'll see a positive impact on your stock. That's the kind of perspective that we see that will make for a positive positioning of an investor relations hire. But if you're thinking that someone's just going to come in and wave a magic wand, that's when things go south. On the investor relations professional side of the equation, we've seen a couple of different situations in the past couple of years where the person has not worked out. And again, it's not always because of them. One person was unlucky because they went in front of a board the day the market crashed and they didn't have all of the answers, and they really showed an inability to think on their toes. They should have, it was it was the first couple of days, but they should have had the ability to say, it's my first week, I'm still getting to know this or that, and they froze in front of a board, and it didn't, it was a hire that didn't work out. Others, are working for a C-suite where they immediately kind of cross ways, and you can tell again that they're not the right personality for that collaborative management style necessary to be successful in this role.
Yeah.
So
for
do
me,
your homework. Reference the executive team you're working for, and make sure you're not working for some insane founder CEO that's burned through 5 investor relations leaders in the past 2 years. Because that's not a you can go in and fix that. That's a stay very far away from it.
Yeah, I think 2020 hindsight's always good. For me, I've had 2 situations. I've done 2 back-to-back IPOs where one I was hired like 4 days before the IPO, and the other one was like 3 weeks before the IPO. From on the sidelines, you would have said they've waited too long. They don't view that position as necessarily as strategic as it is if they've waited till the very last minute to hire an IR person, right? So I think those to me have been some of the big learnings when I see IPOs that are planned within weeks and they still don't have an IRO. I think it speaks volumes as to how they view that position.
Right, and they don't understand how long it's going to take for the person to get to know the business so that they're prepared for that meeting where their CFO turns to them and says, what's that number, or where are we at, and you're going to be in the hot seat. So again, really, really ask those questions, and don't be afraid to take a peek under the hood, ask to sign an NDA, look at the numbers, when you are interviewing, because it's going to matter.
Yeah. Do we have any more questions? Alex, do you have another question you want to ask?
Anything else from the audience? Got a couple. Peter, how about from my side, when you're thinking about steps on what it looks like past being an IRO, whether it's a member of management team or a higher level position within a finance function, potentially an operating function, or even a board position. What are some of the characteristics that you're seeing successful candidates take on to be able to prepare themselves for those types of roles? What should we be thinking about?
Yeah, so in terms of what's after IR, it's always easier to take on more responsibilities in your current role internally than it is to move into a role that's going to be IR plus externally. Unless it's scoped and you've been called for it and you have everything they're looking for, typically those things do not really land in your lap. Oftentimes we are doing a search and we are able to say to the client, this person's great as IR, but they'd also be interesting for IR plus. Have you considered that? And the client typically hasn't. So if you are talking to a new opportunity, get the first or second interview over with, but then start to weave in, I can do more. What would my career look like after I get IR up to speed and running here? If you're internal already and you're looking to wrap your arms around other functions, be strategic about it and look at aligned functions where you naturally take things on, like press relations, communications. ESG has been huge lately, and it's been up and down depending on what industry you're in. But if you're in a manufacturing or mining and metals environment where you can have a real impact on ESG, and it's not just something that you're talking about to talk about, raise your hand to be a part of those conversations and, take on those special projects and they might lead to other things that broaden your function more naturally internally. Every piece of the finance puzzle could be tacked onto IR. FP&A, treasury, anything could be sculpted to make the investor relations leader kind of a deputy CFO. And we have seen situations where the IR leader becomes the CFO. We're working with the CFO client right now at ICE, at the Intercontinental Exchange, Warren Gardiner. He's the former head of IR at the Intercontinental Exchange. And he moved down from New York, where he was housed at the New York Stock Exchange, to be the CFO of ICE. And it's going very well for him down in Atlanta. We've seen other investor relations leaders move into operational leadership roles internally, like Carol Lane, I think it was, at United Technologies, moved into an operational role overseeing one of the business units that spun out of UTC. We've seen other hires that during the hiring process, they say this person would be a great, successor to the CFO. We're not going to say when, but we got to really test the waters the next couple of years. We're going to throw everything we can at them, and they better be ready to adapt. So really, again, I think it's the adaptability factor, taking whatever is thrown at you and raising your hand for those opportunities, and it'll naturally happen. And again, if it's not a CFO role, it could be a head of ESG or a head of impact type of role that's aligned with another executive team member.
Yeah, so you talked about it a bit, right? About being open and taking on these new opportunities. I know that it's helped me tremendously in my career, but especially sitting in that number 2 spot right in my current role. But for those folks who are in that type of position and they're looking to become a number 1, any other suggestions that you have outside of being open or anything to be focused on, to get into that leading seat?
So in terms of proactively doing, taking on credentials, doing things, I don't know if external credentials are worth the investment. I'd almost focus more on the investing your time internally. It's going to be case by case depending on what your organization's looking for and what's happening internally with your team. Because there's not always going to be that finance role to raise your hand for, or an opening to raise your hand for. But making it known that you want more and being proactive about it, I think it's really all you can do.
That's great. That's great. One, I'll save it for closer to the end, Peter, if you wanted to get through the last couple slides, but I do have one more.
So, the next couple of slides are more what we're looking for in general leadership candidates. This all covers what I've talked about, verbally, and I don't think there's anything surprising here in terms of doing your homework, making sure that you're prepared for the interview. Make sure you treat every interview like a two-way conversation. You're not just there to answer questions and nod your head. You want to make sure you're engaged and asking them some pretty tough questions. No one is hiring you to just take the reins and manage a well-oiled machine. If they are, you should probably think about making your role a little bit more well-known, because once it comes to consolidation efforts, you're going to be the least valued person. So you really want to get to the heart of what you're trying to solve here with these questions, and then make sure that you're that valuable hire. We put in an ESG section at the end here just because it's been at the tip of everybody's tongue, and it's been such a topic of consideration with investor relations hires. Investor relations folks are rarely in charge of all, ESG, but always in charge of a piece of it, or always involved with a piece of it. So, again, figuring out that during the interview process so there are no surprises once you're in your seat, and making sure you're not going to step on anyone's toes. My own perspective is that ESG should never be owned by one person. It should always be a shared function between a number of different leaders, and it's because there's the environmental piece, the social piece, and the governance piece, and there is no one person that can oversee all pieces of this puzzle here. Alex, you mentioned another question.
More of a fun one for you, Peter. You've been working with dozens, probably hundreds, maybe thousands of clients, especially in our world. But any war stories that you have from an interview process, things that just went horribly wrong, any terrible experiences that people ran into, and anything that we can learn from your vast experience?
Literally no names.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I will not mention anything indicative of the people or companies that I work for, but we do more searches in this function than all of our competitors combined through our team. So we see a high volume of executive searches every year through government affairs, communications, and investor relations. A lot of times we're working with some pretty high profile clients. We've worked with everyone from the Secretary General of the United Nations to, CEOs of startups where the CEOs are going to jail, and it's just very kind of high pressure scenarios here. But a lot of times on the candidate side, when you're getting towards an offer process, there are surprises where we're thinking why didn't you tell us that? One situation that happens at least once a year in my life is when we get to education verification, and we send a higher education verification form saying, we don't do any criminal background checks, but we do verify degrees. We want to just make sure you graduated the college that you have listed on your resume here. And at least once a year, we get a call from someone saying, I know I have it listed, but I had to drop out. I didn't finish a gym class, and it's always a gym class that they didn't finish. And we have to say that's fine, but you didn't disclose this in time. 2 or 3 times, the person told us right away before the interviews, I don't have a degree. I don't want any surprises. I dropped out and was working, and I got a job, and I never had to go back. And I make a lot of money now, and I don't think I have to go back. Whenever we tell the client that ahead of time, they understand it, and there's never an issue. So the issue is when it comes down to the potential of you coming across as dishonest because it's coming out too late in the game. That is when it goes south. Similar with compensation conversations. If someone, after we've gotten through a compensation conversation, says, I forgot to tell you, but I have a bunch of equity vesting in July, I can't start until then, that will completely derail a conversation because, you know, we'll be thinking through, well, we just had that conversation. Why didn't you bring this up beforehand? And it looks like you're not organized, and, you know, it brings up just a little bit of a flag. So I advise everyone to be honest when you are working with a respected executive search firm where you can confirm they're going to keep your compensation confidential and use it to position yourself for a step up, and you've had that conversation with the recruiter. Be honest about your expectations with the search consultant. When you're working with HR, be a little bit more guarded because you never know how much they understand compensation laws. But when things have gotten derailed, back to your question, the war stories, it's always because of dishonesty and something where there's behavior on one side or another that just completely blows everything up at the end of the day. And you know, once or twice it has been something criminal that's popped up where, you know, the company gets to their background check and they have to call us about, you know, a DUI that was supposed to be scrubbed and it obviously wasn't, and we have to have a very uncomfortable conversation with someone about something in their past. So we have a lot of those fun war stories.
Very helpful, Peter. Thank you so much. That's
Yeah,
it for me.
I don't see any other questions, Alex, from the audience. So did you want to close or?
Happy to. It's an absolutely beautiful day here in the Philadelphia area, so I'm sure
Yes.
everybody is excited to get outside. But Peter, thank you
Thank
so
you
much
so
for your
much.
time. Rebecca, thank you very much for putting this all together. Thank you
Sure.
for everyone for joining, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone on May 11th. Look for an invite coming out on that soon. All right.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you,
See you
Peter.
all soon.
Bye.
Bye.